of. The ink on her father's signature wasn't even dry when Hattie Burrell realized she was no longer a daughter. She was a debt settled, $22 and a breeding sow. That was what Denton Aldridge had owed Marsh Fallow for going on 3 years, and that was what Hattie cost to clear. She found out the way she found out most things in her family. By accident, standing in the wrong doorway at the wrong time, hearing her name spoken the way men spoke about livestock at auction. Matter of fact, no ceremony to it. Marsh Fallow was 41 years old, a dry goods farmer outside the town of Kettle Creek, Wyoming. His first wife had died in childbirth 4 years back. His second had lasted 8 months before walking into the winter prairie and not walking back out. The town of Kettle Creek had their theories about that. None of them were charitable toward Marsh. Hattie was 23 years old and had never been farther than 12 miles from the house she was born in. She packed one trunk. She didn't cry. Crying meant she cared about what was being taken from her, and she had made a decision, standing in that doorway, listening to her father's voice, that she was done caring about anything this family gave or withheld. She folded 2 dresses, a wool shawl, her mother's bone-handled knife, and a small tin of dried lavender that smelled like the only good thing she could remember about her childhood. Her father didn't come out of the barn to watch her go. The wagon that collected her belonged to Marsh's hired man, a thin, sunburned boy of about 16 who didn't say a word the entire 4-hour ride north. He just chewed a piece of dried grass and stared at the road like a man who had learned not to be curious about things that weren't his business. Hattie sat in the wagon bed with her trunk and watched the flat Wyoming scrubland unspool behind her. The sky was the color of old pewter. The wind tasted like iron and coming rain. She had heard things about Marsh Fallow. In a town the size of Kettle Creek, you heard everything whether you wanted to or not. That he was a hard man. That he worked his land like he had a personal grievance against it. That his second wife's people, a family named Ashford, from over in Larimer County, had come through 2 winters ago, asking questions that nobody in Kettle Creek had wanted to answer. None of it mattered now. It wasn't like she'd been given a choice. The Fallow property sat at the end of a rutted track off the main road, half a mile from the nearest neighbor. The house was 2 stories of weathered gray clapboard, solid enough but stripped of anything decorative, as if whoever built it had run out of either money or inclination halfway through and never returned to finish. A windmill turned slowly in the far field. 3 horses watched her arrival from behind a split-rail fence with the bored, sovereign calm of animals who had seen this before. Marsh was standing on the porch when the wagon pulled up. He was not what she had pictured. She had pictured older, meaner looking. He was tall and raw-boned, with a face that might have been handsome once before weather and work had carved it down to something harder. His hair was dark, going gray at the temples. He held a coffee mug in one hand and watched her climb down from the wagon with an expression that gave away absolutely nothing. "Miss Burrell," he said. "Mr. Fallow," she replied. He nodded once, as if they had agreed on something, and held the porch door open. The inside of the house was clean, which surprised her. Not warm, not welcoming. There were no curtains, no rugs, no pictures on the walls, but clean. The floors had been swept. The dishes were stacked. The cold hearth had been recently blacked. It was the house of a man who maintained things out of discipline rather than any affection for comfort. "You'll take the room at the top of the stairs," Marsh said, setting his mug down on the kitchen table. "The boy Cade sleeps in the loft above the barn. Meals are at 5, noon, and 6. I'm out before sunrise most mornings. I expect breakfast on the stove when I come in at 7. "How old is Cade?" Hattie asked. Marsh paused. He turned and looked at her as if he hadn't expected her to ask questions, or perhaps hadn't expected her to have a voice that worked. 14, he said. "He was my wife's sister's boy. She died last spring. He doesn't have anywhere else to go." Hattie nodded. A boy with nowhere to go. She understood that particular geography perfectly. "I'll need to know where you keep your stores," she said, moving toward the kitchen. "And whether the pump out back freezes in October." Marsh stared at her for a moment. "It does," he said. You have to run warm water over the handle." "All right," Hattie said. She opened the pantry and began taking stock. She heard him leave through the back door without another word. The first 2 weeks were an education in what a house sounds like when nobody in it wants to be there. Marsh left before light and came back after dark, tracking field mud across the clean floors she'd just scrubbed, eating his supper in 4 minutes flat, and retreating to the small room off the kitchen he used as an office. He never raised his voice. He never said an unkind word. He moved through his own house like a man serving a sentence he had come to terms with. The boy, Cade, was a different problem. He was 14 and furious and had nowhere to put it. He didn't speak directly to Hattie for the first 10 days. He'd answer questions with the minimal possible number of syllables. Yes, no, don't know. He ate breakfast standing up, leaning against the far wall like he was ready to bolt, watching her with his aunt's dark eyes and a jaw set hard enough to crack stone. She didn't push. She had been 14 once, and she remembered what it felt like to have your world rearranged without your consent. On the 12th day, she found him out behind the barn trying to rehang a gate with a warped hinge and the wrong size nail, swearing under his breath with a fluency that suggested long practice. She watched him for a minute. He felt her watching, and his shoulders locked up tight. "The nail's too small," she said. "You need the square-headed ones from the red tin on the second shelf." He said nothing, but after a minute, he dropped the nail he was holding and went to get the right ones. She went back inside and put more coffee on. It wasn't friendship, it was a provisional ceasefire based on the recognition that they were both stuck here, and making it harder wasn't going to unmake it. The town of Kettle Creek had opinions about Hattie Burrell, same as it had had opinions about everything. She felt it the first time Marsh drove her in to collect supplies from the dry goods store at the end of October. The way Mrs. Pell behind the counter asked how she was settling in with a tone that meant something different than the words. The way the two women by the flour barrels went quiet when she walked past. The way the man who ran the feed store, a heavy-set, red-faced man named Dodd, who'd apparently known Marsh's second wife, watched her with an expression she couldn't entirely read but didn't like. She let them look. She picked up 50 pounds of winter wheat, 2 yards of heavy flannel, a bottle of lamp oil, and a box of the peppermints Cade thought she hadn't noticed him eyeing on her last visit. She paid what was owed and didn't smile at anyone she didn't mean it for. In the wagon on the way home, Marsh said Dodd was asking questions about you in town before you arrived. Hattie kept her eyes on the road. What kind of questions? Whether you were the kind to stay. She thought about that. What did you tell him? Nothing, Marsh said. It's not his business. He paused. Is it true? Are you the kind to stay? The question landed differently than she expected. It wasn't a threat or a trap. It was something more like a real question, the kind that lived in the throat a long time before it got said out loud. I don't know yet, Hattie said, which was more honest than she'd intended to be. Marsh looked at her sidelong. Then he looked back at the road. Fair enough, he said. November arrived like a fist. The cold that came off the high prairie north of Kettle Creek was not the passive chill of autumn. It was an aggressive, seeking thing that found every gap in the window casing and every thin spot in the boot leather and settled in. The windmill froze solid on the 5th of the month. Marsh spent an entire day thawing it out with a coal brazier, while Hattie kept the house stove cranked to a roar and made a soup from dried salt beef and turnips that was mostly hot water but was at least hot. Cade got sick on the 8th. Not the creeping kind of sick, the kind you could manage. It came on hard and fast, the way the worst things do. She heard him at 4 in the morning, a dragging, uneven sound from the barn loft, and she pulled her coat over her nightgown and crossed the frozen yard in the dark without stopping to think about it. He was on his pallet, shaking so hard, the straw underneath him was rustling. His skin was wet and pale as tallow except for a high, brutal flush on his cheeks. His breathing had a quality to it she didn't like. A thinness, like something was pressing on his chest from the inside. She got him down from the loft by herself. He was barely conscious and heavier than he looked, all teenage bones and rigid muscle, and she hauled him across the yard and through the back door and got him onto the kitchen settle by the stove. She built the fire up until the iron ticked and groaned with heat. She stripped his wet shirt off him, wrapped him in every blanket in the house, and started a pot of water with the dried horehound and willow bark she'd brought in her trunk because her mother had taught her to bring things that mattered. She sat with him all night. Somewhere around 2 in the morning, she was so tired she stopped being able to think in full sentences. She was just doing the next thing. Press the cool cloth, check the breathing, feed a little more wood into the stove, check the breathing again. At some point, she put her head down on the edge of the settle for what she thought was a minute. She woke to the sound of the back door opening. Marsh was standing in the kitchen doorway. He was still in his coat, smelling of cold air and horse. He had apparently tried to go out to the barn for the morning feeding and found Cade's pallet empty. His eyes moved from the boy sleeping on the settle to Hattie, who was blinking at him from the floor where she'd fallen asleep, sitting up against the settle's leg, her hair loose and her coat still on over her nightgown. The expression on his face was not something she'd seen on him before. It took her a moment to place it because she hadn't been looking for it. It was fear, the kind that had already resolved into something else because the worst hadn't happened, sitting alongside something that looked like it might be a kind of rough gratitude. "He broke the fever about an hour ago," Hattie said. Her voice was hoarse, breathing's clearer now. Marsh walked over to the settle and stood looking down at Cade, who was sleeping with the deep, surrendered quality of someone whose body has been working very hard and has finally been allowed to stop. Marsh reached down and pulled the blanket up another inch over the boy's shoulder. It was such a small gesture and so utterly unguarded that Hattie felt like she'd seen something she wasn't supposed to. He straightened up. He looked at her for a long moment. "Go to bed," he said. "I'll watch him." "I'm fine," she started. "Hattie." The way he said her name was different from how he usually said it, which was precisely and at a distance. "Go to bed," she went. She lay in the room at the top of the stairs and stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind push against the clapboard and thought about the way he'd said her name, just her name. Nothing attached to it, but the way a person says a name when they mean it as a whole thing, not a handle. She slept for 11 hours. The winter ground on. January was brutal and February was worse. The snow came in sideways off the flats and piled against the north side of the house until the upstairs window was half buried. They ran through the lamp oil faster than Marsh had calculated. For 3 weeks in February they were eating mostly dried beans and cornbread and a smoked ham that Hattie rationed down to the bone. But something was changing in the house. It happened in small increments, the way warmth comes back into a room that's been cold too long. Slowly and from multiple directions at once. So you can't point to the exact moment it shifted. Cade started eating breakfast at the table instead of standing against the wall. He started talking, actually talking, not performing the minimum. First about practical things like whether the east pasture fence would need replacing before spring, then about other things, memories of his aunt, the way she'd made biscuits, a dog he'd had when he was small. Hattie listened the way she'd learned to listen, without commenting too much, without making it a bigger moment than it wanted to be. Marsh was slower. He was a man who had built a considerable amount of interior architecture around not being reached, and he was careful about the whole enterprise. But he started saying good morning when he came in from the barn. He started leaving her small things without explanation. The right-sized hinge pins she'd needed for the cellar door, a book of pressed wildflowers he'd found in a box of his first wife's things left on the kitchen table without a note. He asked her once, out of nowhere, while she was beating a rug out on the porch, whether she had ever wanted to do something different with her life. She stopped mid-swing. Different how? Different than this, he said. He was fixing a split in the porch rail, not looking at her. Different than what you got handed. She thought about it honestly. "I wanted to study," she said. "There was a school teacher when I was young who said I had a quick mind. I thought about teaching." "You still could," Marsh said. "I'm here," she said, meaning it simply, not bitterly. He looked up from the porch rail then. Just for a second. The winter light was thin and pale, and it hit the side of his face in a way that showed the tiredness in him, the years of it, and something underneath the tiredness that was still there despite everything. "I know," he said. "I'm not saying you're not." She went back to beating the rug, but she thought about it for the rest of the day. April came, and with it the mud, and the necessity of going back to Kettle Creek for spring supplies. The morning they went in, Hattie put on the better of her 2 dresses and pinned her hair up properly. and did not do either of those things to impress anyone in Kettle Creek. She did them because she had decided something over the winter, quietly and without drama, the way she made most of her decisions, which was that she was not going to spend the rest of her life being a rumor this town got to tell about itself. The dry goods store was busy when they arrived. It was the first real spring day, one of those Wyoming mornings that makes you understand why people stayed out here despite everything. The sky absurdly blue, and the air smelling of thaw and new mud and possibility. Half the county seemed to have decided to come into Kettle Creek for supplies at the same time. Dodd was outside the feed store when they pulled up. He watched Hattie climb down from the wagon with the particular quality of attention that men like him gave to women they had already decided things about. "Still here, then," he said. He said it to the air, loud enough to carry. Hattie did not look at him. She tied the reins to the hitching post with the same 2 half hitches she used every time and walked toward the dry goods store. Dodd said something else, lower, to the 2 men standing beside him. There was a laugh. Marsh had come around the front of the wagon. He stopped. He was not a man who moved quickly or with drama. He simply placed himself in a particular way that meant something. He looked at Dodd for a moment without expression. "You got something to say about what goes on at my property, Dodd," Marsh said, his voice carrying the flat, quiet quality of a man who is not asking a question. "You can say it to me directly." The street did its thing that streets do. The near silence that is not actually silence, but all the ambient sound dropping away while people attend to what's happening. Dodd made a sound that was supposed to be easy. "No offense meant, Marsh. Just, I heard what you said," Marsh said. He turned and walked toward the dry goods store. He held the door for Hattie. She walked through. Inside, Mrs. Pell was watching from behind the counter with an expression Hattie couldn't be bothered to interpret. She pulled her list from her coat pocket. 40 pounds of flour, Mrs. Pell. 20 pounds of cornmeal, 3 yards of the bleached muslin, a box of the number 8 nails, and a tin of those peppermints. She set her list on the counter. "I'll pay for it all today." "Marsh usually runs a tab," Mrs. Pell started. "I know what Marsh usually does," Hattie said. "Not unkind, just clear. We're settling it today and starting fresh." Mrs. Pell looked at her. Then she looked at Marsh, who had come to stand just inside the door, his arms crossed over his chest, watching above. Something shifted in the older woman's expression. Not warmth, more like recalculation. The kind a person does when they realize the story they'd been telling about someone might need revising. "All right then," Mrs. Pell said, and reached for the flour scoop. They were out of the store in 20 minutes. Cade had materialized from wherever he'd been and was helping load the wagon. And while Hattie handed up the cornmeal sacks, she could feel the weight of the town's attention like something weather-related, atmospheric. Let them look. Let them recalibrate. When the wagon was loaded, Marsh climbed up and took the reins. He looked down at her from the seat with an expression she had learned, over the winter, to read, which was that he had something he was working out whether to say. She climbed up beside him. He handed her the lap robe for the cold. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "The tab, I know," Hattie said. "It was a considerable sum. I know what it was." She tucked the lap robe around her knees. "Marsh, I don't want to be something that's owed to you. I want to be something you chose." The words cost her something. She felt it in her chest when they came out, the specific vulnerability of having said a true thing before she was certain how it would land. Marsh sat with it for a moment. The horses shifted in their traces. Cade had climbed into the wagon bed and was already into the peppermints, apparently having decided that discretion was for people without peppermints. "I know the difference," Marsh said finally. He was looking at the road ahead, but the set of his jaw had changed, just slightly. Loosened somewhere it had been held tight. "I've known it for a while." He clicked his tongue and the horses moved out. The road back north ran straight through the last of the morning's bright cold, past the scrub and the black soil fields just starting to breathe under the snowmelt. Hattie watched the land open out ahead of them. She thought about the teacher who had said she had a quick mind. She thought about what it meant to be chosen versus settled, and how it turned out sometimes those things could become the same thing if you were patient enough and stubborn enough and refuse to be less than what you were, even when everything around you suggested that might be easier. She thought about Kettle Creek and the way Mrs. Pell's expression had shifted, that specific moment of recalculation, and understood that she had earned something today that couldn't be purchased or borrowed. You couldn't arrive with it, you had to stay for it, through the frozen pumps and the sick boy, and the long silent suppers and the February when there was nothing to eat but beans, until the town adjusted its understanding of who you were. She wasn't finished here, Dove. That was the thing she'd figured out, somewhere between the first frost and the first thaw. She wasn't just surviving this place, she was building something in it. Something solid and hers. Marsh's shoulder was warm where it pressed against hers on the buckboard. He didn't move away. Neither did she. Dove. Behind them, Cade fell asleep in the wagon bed with his cheek against a flour sack and his coat bunched up under his head, and the sound of his breathing was even and easy in the clean spring air, and the horses moved at a steady walk up the road toward home.